Danny Gallagher, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversations.
Look at thanks so much for having me on.
So, my family comes from Montreal. So, after the Mets, Montreal is my second favorite team. You're living in the Toronto area now?
That's right. So I've been in Toronto for about 25 years.
All right, so you've been putting out books about the Expos at an amazing rate. How is it that you have never taken up with the Blue Jays?
Well, I've always been a fan of the Blue Jays right from day one in 1977. But since I uh, joined the Expos beat in 1988, my passion for the Expos really electrified. No, I grew up near Ottawa, Canada, cheering for the Expos and making a few trips to Montreal, to Jerry Park and Olympic Stadium before I became a journalist. And but it is an interesting question. I do like the Blue Jays, but I've never done a book on the Blue Jays.
Well, maybe that's your next project. Uh, Many years ago, the Mets, in one of their yearbooks, put out a poster of every player that ever played with the franchise. And at the time, this was back in the, I'm going to say mid 70s. So there were, since the Mets started in 62, there were only like a couple of hundred or a few hundred players. The way you put out your books, it almost seems like every player on the Expos could have his own story.
Oh, exactly. See, I do a lot of stories on players who are not stars or just maybe middle of the road players, part-time players, pitchers who maybe, just kind of middle of the road. What I'm trying to do is give them some legacy, give them some devotion to the time that they spent with the Expos. It's starting with the history of growing up and the minor leagues and getting drafted and making it to the major leagues and different stories about what they encountered in the baseball career and so it's a combination of stars and superstars and middle of the road players that I read about.
When you're picking your stories, I mean, I imagine at some point a lot of the stories are similar. The guys were stars in high school. If they went to college, they were stars in college, and they hit the minors, and they started hitting snags because it's not really a trickle. It's more of a trickle up theory, I guess, to describe it. But is there must be some that even now, after you've written, and I'm counting at least 8 books on the Expos that I've got. Maybe I missed one or two down the line. Is there anyone that really stands out higher than anyone else with an interesting story?
There have been many. I can maybe pick one, not necessarily the highest, but Rick DeHart in the late 1990s. He heard about it. He was in Wichita, Topeka, Kansas, and he heard about an Expos tryout camp in Florida. So he decided to, after reading the notice in the Baseball Weekly newspaper, which is no longer in business, there was an ad advertising this camp in Florida. So he decided he's going to go there, and he took a Greyhound bus to Florida, and he went to the camp, and the Expos kind of liked him, and they brought him to the Lantana, Florida minor league camp, which is another separate from the tryout camp. And they eventually, within a few days, he said he was almost ready to come back to Topeka because he was kind of getting the runaround from the Expos people. And finally said, yeah, we're going to sign you because we think you have a future. Now, he did not have, a long career or anything in the major leagues, but just the fact that he took a Greyhound from Kansas to Florida and he ended up making the majors and getting a major league pension out of it was really something really impressed me.
From all the players that you've spoken with, have there been any who didn't want their stories told, who are like more reluctant, more private, that you wish you could have spoken with?
Yeah, there's a number of guys who without the intervention of other people that they knew, they probably wouldn't have never talked to me. Um, yeah, there are guys who I've tried over the years to talk to me, but they never responded. I mean, so I just move on to more players. And the one guy I wish I was able to talk to, and I didn't. I ended up writing a chapter about him anyway, and talked to other people. Was the really picture Mike Marshall, Dr. Mike Marshall, who had a PhD, a very colorful guy who tended to raise a lot of trouble. So the headline on my chapter for him was a screwball with a screwball, meaning he was a bit of a screwball mind, but he had a tremendous screwball pitch. So that was the kind of story on Mike Marshall. Tremendous pitcher with the Expos and then the Dodgers and some other teams. But the Expos got fed up with him after the 1973 season and traded him to the Dodgers for another player who was kind of at the end of his time with the Dodgers, Willie Davis. So, Mike Marshall is one of those guys, Ron, who I wish I could have talked to, but he just was not in the mood to talk.
When you started on the Expos beat, for which newspaper did you write?
Montreal Daily News, and then it went out. It was a brand new paper that tried to compete with the Montreal Gazette, but then it went out of business after a couple of years. And then I worked for the Ottawa Sun newspaper full time out of Montreal, and then later the Associated Press and the Globe and Mail out of Toronto.
The was the Star still in business at the time?
No, the Star had folded in 1978, so I started in 1988, and the Daily News was a great experience. It got me introduced into professional baseball coverage, so it was quite an honor to finally get into the pro ranks.
So 88, that means the Expos were already playing at Olympic Stadium, so you never really had a chance to cover them at Jarry Park.
That's right. So I went to a couple of games as a fan at Jarry Park, and then 1988, it was my introduction to Dennis Martinez, a pitcher who had his drinking problems with the Orioles, and then resurrected his career with the Expos. So he ended up being one of my two all-time favorite Expos, tied for number one with Rusty Staub. And to this day, Dennis and I have a fairly good relationship, and we talk a few times every year.
Do you remember when you went to Jerry where you sat?
Where I sat, no, but my experience with George Foster was at bat for the Cincinnati Reds, and I had gone to the concession stand to get 2 beers. So I had 2 beers in my hand, and Foster hits a high pop up, and there's no way I'm going to be able to catch it with 2 beers in my hand. Yeah.
So you caught the pop up, but you lost the beer?
I decided not to put down my beers. I mean,
Priorities. I remember when I went to Jerry, I always sat on the first base side. So if you remember, the first base side with the sun going down over the left field wall always was a health hazard for the first baseman.
yeah, it's the stands were so close to the field and so close to the players that the fans could really see these players up front really close.
Have you ever thought, with all the books you've done about the Expos, have you ever thought of putting together a book of trivia?
Yeah, there's certainly somebody has brought that up before. It would certainly be a worthwhile book round. But there's certainly a lot of stuff that can be put into a trivia book for sure.
I bring that up because I keep a tally every week of the best-selling baseball books according to Amazon, and especially during the winter months, there's a series of trivia books by this one particular author. He writes all these different trivia books. Haven't seen one about the Expos, but there were I mean I keep track of the top 10 books, and he's got like 5 or 6 in like November, December after the season's over, before the spring training starts, and the fantasy baseball books come out. He's quite prolific.
Yeah, there's lots of certainly a lot of ideas that I could do for Expos books. What I've been concentrating on, over the years is vignettes. They're short and long stories about different players and events and executives and special games and so on.
What was it like the last couple of years covering the Expos? Because they were under threat of contraction, they were threat relocation, just totally shutting down. Major League Baseball took over the running of the club, and that didn't work out too well. So, what was the vibe like in the press box?
Well, it was they had to. I didn't go to any games in Puerto Rico, but they had to play 2003 and 2004 games in Puerto Rico. It was a way for Major League Baseball to see if the Expos could be, I don't know, relocated to Puerto Rico, but they wanted to build up a fan base and trigger new revenues in those 2 years to offset the fact that not many fans were watching the games in Montreal. But it was really odd that the Expos were under the ownership shingle of Major League Baseball. There was no man or woman who owned the Expos. It was a corporation of baseball Expos limited partners, including all the major league owners. It was pretty weird.
I was up there in 2004 for the last homestand of the season because at the time I was contemplating doing a book. I was expecting them to be contracted, and I wanted to see what it was like in the death knell of the Expos. So they granted me press box privileges, and I was able to go to Frank Robinson's pre and post game uh, little conferences. And at that point of the season, with that hanging over their heads, I imagine Robinson must have been just absolutely gassed about talking about the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, the players were faced with the fact, where are we going to play next year? Are we going to be folded? Are we going to be contracted? Are we going to? So especially the last year, they didn't know. See, they didn't know whether they would be playing in Montreal in 2005 or elsewhere, because Major League Baseball waited until the night of September 28th, when Claude DeLong, the vice president of business services, was notified about a rumor that Major League Baseball had made a decision to move the team to Washington. So the word was officially made at a news conference the next day, September 29th, which was one of the worst days in Expos history. And so that was but all through the 2004 season, the players had never been given any indication that they would be moved to 2005. The major league schedule for 2005 included Montreal.
Hmm.
So, and then, so the Expos people were following that schedule. Okay, we're going to spring training again in Melbourne in 2005, but then all of a sudden they picked the last home game to say that it's history for the Expos in Montreal. And then, the final game was October the 3rd in New York, but the September 29th was actually the worst day in franchise history, more so than October the 3rd, because it was a home game,
Mhm.
and a lot of the fans, 31,000 fans, had showed up to witness the final game. And before the announcement had been made, only about 12,000 people I bought tickets for that final game, and when they found out that the Expos were leaving, about another 20,000 people went to the box office and got tickets the same day to get a souvenir and buy sweaters and tops and caps and whatever. So it was a pretty sad day. The players ended up going into the Expos offices and then expressing sorrow with all the front office people, the secretaries, and so on. So it was a pretty bad day.
Yeah, it reminds me, the opposite seemed to happen when the Dodgers left Brooklyn. They, didn't excuse me, they didn't have a whole lot of people show up for and they knew they were leaving, and they had a very poor, attendance for their last home game. It also reminds me in, the early '70s, the Padres, who came into the league with the Expos in '69, there was rumors that they were going to move to Washington. So when Topps printed the baseball cards for that year, and I don't remember exactly which year it was, they had the players without hats, and the bottom of the card just said Washington because they didn't know where they were moving, and they didn't have a name for the team yet.
Oh, really? Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
Uh, Montreal is known for having a very loyal fan base, albeit not very big. Uh, do you think the Expos, do you think Montreal will ever get another franchise?
It's uh, it's kind of bleak. I think that they need to find somebody with very deep pockets because the expansion franchise is probably going to cost about 3 billion Canadian,
It's
and
3 billion with a B?
3 billion, yeah, Canadian.
Yeah.
And they say about 2.3 billion US.
Mhm.
But so they need a lot of money just to put up the franchise fee, and then well, they have to build another stadium downtown
Yeah.
instead of Olympic Stadium. Rob Manfred said years ago that they're not going to play in Olympic Stadium. You know, they fixed it up a bit, but
It's kind of in the
so
middle of nowhere.
yeah, it's a way out in the East End. It's a concrete block, but it served its purpose for a number of years. But certainly, Major League Baseball and the city of Montreal or whoever hopes to get another team has to build a stadium downtown, 35,000 people, and but it's all up in the air. January, it's over 3 years now that Stephen Bronfman's group was told that the split season sister city concept with Tampa Bay was being turned down by the owners.
Hmm.
So January of 2022, that happened, and in the last 3 years, there's been nothing going on. So there was lots of fever from 2012 to 2022, 10 years, when Warren Cromartie in 2012 started beating the drums for a new franchise. From 2004 to 2012, there was no interest in getting another team. So for 3 years now, nobody has really shown any interest in getting another team. I would think, here's my thought, it would be a shame and an embarrassment if Montreal does not put a bid in for an expansion prize. It would be very embarrassing. Whether that's in a few years or 2029, I don't know.
Excuse me. Uh, Trying to think. The with all of the books you've done, are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, the next one is coming out in 2026, Ron. It's another book of about 45 or 50 chapters on Expos players, but I'm highlighting Willie Davis, who played in 1974 in Montreal. But I'm also spending time about Willie Davis and his time with the Dodgers and the different negative things that happened to him in his lifetime, including he got beamed a couple of times in 1969 with the Dodgers, and his first wife, talked to me for the book, And I guess I can't say too much now, but said that the concussions kind of affected him for the rest of his life, even though he continued to be a pretty decent player. But I've uncovered a lot of stuff about Willie Davis in my book. I'm looking forward to it coming out with Dundurn Press in May of 2026. So I
Well, well,
talked to a lot of other people involved with Willie Davis, including also one of his daughters, and a lot of Expos players that played with him. And so I've got about 7 chapters in that book on Willie Davis. Then the other maybe 38 chapters on other Expos players. So it's called The Tragedy of Willie Davis, and the subtitle, And More Expos Stories.
hmm. Oh, we're going to be looking forward to that. Danny Gallagher, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today. Hope you're nice and warm over there in Toronto. The weather here in Jersey hasn't been that great the last few days with the snow and the rain. So thank you very much and continue good luck to you, sir.
Look at Ron. Thanks so much for having me on Bookshelf Conversations.